On a quiet stretch of back road in rural Florida, a passerby called 911 after witnessing something he could hardly describe. A car sat parked, partially hidden by trees. Inside, two people were tangled together. One of them a well-known pastor, pants around his knees. The other? A young woman who had, just months earlier, been investigated in connection to the murder of his wife. By the time police arrived, one of them was dead, shot 10 times. The other was too stunned to speak. But what led to that shooting would become one of the most disturbing investigations the town had ever seen. Because it wasn't just about infidelity. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about a daughter, her best friend, her mother's murder, and the secret that tied all of them to a single trigger pull. Welcome to True Crime's Corner. If stories like this shake you, if they make you pause and think about how quickly secrets can destroy even the most faithful of families, then don't just watch in silence. Subscribe, share, and help bring light to the darkest corners. Because stories like these aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be remembered. For over 20 years, Pastor William's soul and Carly's soul have been happily married with 2 children, Catherine and Michael. Their lives were, to most people, a blueprint for a faithful, functional family. Their home was one of those places that felt like it belonged on a church bulletin cover, clean-cut, quiet, and deeply spiritual. They were respected, admired, and in some circles, envied. The couple had met in youth ministry, where their relationship bloomed under the encouragement of church elders. After their wedding, Williams began preaching while Carly supported him through the years, often hosting Bible study groups and organizing community outreach programs. Together, they raised their children to be polite, intelligent, and grounded in faith. Catherine and Michael, twins, were known among neighbors as sharp, good-looking, and well-mannered, the kind of kids people imagined would grow into leadership themselves. But like many families wrapped in a perfect exterior, there were things no one saw. Privately, Carly had been carrying the guilt of a one-time mistake. Months earlier, she'd confided in a close friend that she'd made a poor decision, a moment of weakness with a much younger man from their church, a parishioner not much older than Michael. She had been overwhelmed, emotionally distant from her husband at the time, and, according to that friend, convinced that her mistake would cost her everything. But the affair didn't remain hidden. Weeks after it happened, Williams had seen a message pop up on her phone, a name he recognized, a text that didn't sound innocent. It led to a confrontation, brief, tense, and private. No police were called, no counselors involved. But from that day forward, something shifted in their home. Carly had apologized. She'd explained herself and pleaded for forgiveness, and by all accounts, Williams accepted. They continued going to church, speaking at couples' retreats, even hosting friends for dinners. Carly doubled her efforts to rebuild trust, showing up to every service, staying by his side, supporting every sermon. But there was a weight behind Williams's smile now. His tone in sermons shifted subtly, more fire, less warmth. At home he was quieter, more reflective. Some who were close to the family later told investigators they sensed a shift after the incident, but nothing they could point to, nothing they could act on. They were still, at least publicly, a family who got through the storm. Behind closed doors, though, Williams was processing the betrayal in ways no one could see. That included finding comfort in a different kind of distraction, one that would set off a chain of consequences far worse than the affair that started it all. At that time, Catherine, now in her 20s, had recently introduced her best friend to the family, a girl named Emily Taylor. And slowly, the weight in the Sowell household began shifting again. Emily Taylor wasn't known for much before she started spending time with the Sowell family. In fact, she rarely drew attention to herself at all. Her background was one of instability, an absent father and a mother who'd struggled for years with addiction. There were no pictures of birthday parties on social media, no glowing school achievements, no family portraits. Just a quiet girl from a fractured home trying to find a way forward. Catherine Sowell met Emily during a university-sponsored community outreach event. The two connected easily. Catherine, raised in a structured, faith-filled home, saw in Emily a girl in need of support. Not pity, support. They began spending time together off campus. Catherine would invite Emily over to study, join family dinners, and attend church services. Slowly, Emily became a familiar face around the house. According to later statements from family friends, Emily was polite, soft-spoken, and always eager to help with chores or errands when visiting. Carly had reportedly welcomed her with warmth, occasionally referring to her as another daughter in the house. Michael, Catherine's twin, didn't say much about her, but he never objected to her presence either. At first, there was nothing unusual about Emily's visits. She was respectful, quiet, even nervous at times, traits often associated with someone unused to being in a stable home environment. But the more comfortable she became, the more time she spent with the family, and eventually she was around almost as often as she was in her own apartment. Pastor Sowell had taken note of her early on. He was cordial, like any father figure might be toward his daughter's close friend. But something about their interactions began to shift. People who had seen Emily at church events described subtle changes, longer conversations, shared glances, small gestures that didn't seem odd in the moment, but took on greater weight later. No one suspected anything inappropriate. Not yet. From the outside, it looked like the family had taken in a girl who needed direction, who needed faith. Williams had spoken many times about the importance of extending grace to young people from troubled homes. Emily fit that mold perfectly. Over the months, she seemed to thrive under their roof. Her clothes became more polished, her speech more confident. She started volunteering at church and was often seen at community functions alongside Catherine. There were even times she stayed overnight when her mother's behavior became too unpredictable. By all appearances, it was a beautiful picture. One girl being saved from a difficult life by a wholesome, godly family. But in hindsight, investigators would later describe that period as the calm before the unraveling. Because while the Sowells were unknowingly pulling Emily into their home, something else was happening beneath the surface, and it would come to light far too late. According to the investigation timeline, the earliest signs of something inappropriate between Pastor William Sowell and Emily Taylor began around the time Emily had started staying over more frequently. She'd begun showing up even on days Catherine wasn't home. While there was no formal record of complaints during that period, neighbors and fellow church members later told detectives they'd seen Emily arriving and leaving the Sowell residence at odd hours, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late into the night. What began under the pretense of mentorship gradually evolved. Williams reportedly offered Emily guidance, support, and a listening ear. For someone from a background where male stability had been absent, that kind of attention held weight. But this wasn't just mentorship. Authorities reviewing the case noted that his behavior with Emily stood out even among those he counseled. His wife, Carly, was said to be unaware of just how frequent their one-on-one interactions had become. There were no direct eyewitnesses to their first intimate encounter, but forensic investigators later retrieved deleted messages and digital activity, suggesting that the relationship had crossed boundaries months before it ever came under suspicion. Emily reportedly believed Pastor Sowell had developed real feelings for her. Based on text logs, she began asking questions about his marriage, their future, and what their relationship meant beyond the walls of the house. Records showed that the pastor began making promises, ones he never mentioned to his family or church. He suggested, in several messages, that he was considering filing for divorce, that she deserved more than just secrecy, that she would soon have a place not just in his life, but in his ministry. Emily, who had once entered the Sowell household as a guest, now saw herself as something more. She continued attending church. She served, sang, participated in youth events. The line between worship and want blurred as she grew more comfortable in her role, not just as Catherine's friend, but as someone who believed she was next in line to be a Sowell. Behind closed doors, the pastor was doubling down on secrecy. He kept his phone closely guarded. He insisted on meeting Emily only when no one else was home. He avoided digital trails when he could. But the deeper the relationship went, the harder it became to hide. It was clear to investigators that the pastor never expected the truth to come out. But within the text threads and phone logs, later recovered and used in trial proceedings, there was a consistent thread of manipulation. It wasn't just affection. It was control. Promises made in private. Boundaries crossed behind pulpit doors. There were no public confrontations, no accusations, no early collapse, just a steady, silent descent. As the investigation deepened, digital evidence revealed that Emily Taylor had been involved in another relationship, one the pastor himself hadn't known about. Forensic review of her phone and personal accounts indicated that around the same time she was engaging in a secret relationship with Pastor Sowell, she was also intimately involved with his son, Michael. Michael, like his twin sister Catherine, was in his early 20s. Friends described him as charismatic and laid-back, someone who, unlike his father, didn't seek attention in spiritual spaces. He was less involved in church leadership and more focused on his own social life, including late-night outings and weekend parties. Emily's connection to Michael appeared, at least initially, to be casual, a relationship born out of proximity and youthful curiosity. But it wasn't just a fling. According to texts recovered from Michael's device, he and Emily were sexually involved for several months. He believed their relationship was mutual and exclusive. There was nothing to suggest he had any idea that she was simultaneously involved with his father. Investigators believe that Emily was managing both relationships independently, presenting herself as someone different to each man. With Pastor Sowell, she was the spiritual partner, the woman who could support his ministry and step into a new life as his wife. With Michael, she was the fun, adventurous companion, unburdened by age or obligation. It was a balancing act that couldn't last. Catherine, however, had begun noticing things. She reportedly shared with friends that Emily's behavior around Michael had changed, that she was more protective, more possessive. Still, Catherine didn't press. She assumed her brother was capable of making his own choices and didn't want to interfere. Emily had been her best friend for nearly a year. Questioning her felt like betrayal. At this stage, no confrontation had occurred. Michael, unaware of his father's secret, continued seeing Emily on his own terms, often during times when the house was quiet or Carly wasn't home. Meanwhile, the pastor maintained his own version of the relationship, careful to avoid any overlapping schedules. There were no public slips, no obvious signs to anyone else in the family. From the outside, the Sowells still looked intact. But in hindsight, those close to the family would later describe a growing tension in the home. Michael became more withdrawn. Catherine seemed distracted. Emily, once casual and light-hearted, had become noticeably more intense in her interactions with the family. Small gestures, subtle body language, things that didn't stand out in the moment, took on much more meaning once the truth came out. What investigators would later determine is that Emily believed she was playing the long game, securing a future with the man who held power, while maintaining closeness with the man she could easily manipulate. She never expected the pieces to collide, and neither did the souls. There was no confrontation, no dramatic outburst, just a few minutes alone in a bathroom and a phone left unlocked on the bed. According to police records, Catherine Soule had been at home that afternoon, studying in the living room while Emily took a call in the bathroom. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Catherine, who hadn't been suspicious of Emily before, later told investigators that something compelled her to check the messages. Perhaps instinct, perhaps timing. What she saw wasn't just alarming. It was life-altering. One of the message threads was with a contact saved under the name Sugar Plum. At first, Catherine assumed it was a nickname for a college friend or a private joke. But the messages didn't sound like something between peers. They were laced with romantic undertones, possessive tones, and coded language. The replies came from someone who referred to Emily as mine, who promised her a future, who made references to clearing the path. Catherine checked the contact number against her father's in her own phone. It matched. The realization was jarring. Emily, her best friend, the girl she had welcomed into their home, trusted with her secrets, and defended, was not only sleeping with her father, but actively plotting to dismantle what was left of their family. The messages included photos, meeting arrangements, private jokes about Carly's absence, and thinly veiled references to a plan. There was no mention of direct harm, no explicit plan of violence, but there was enough to suggest that Emily believed her relationship with Pastor Soule had conditions. Conditions that included his wife no longer being part of the picture. Catherine didn't confront Emily. She didn't even tell her brother. Investigators later confirmed she quietly took screenshots and stored them in a private folder on her own device. Over the next several days, she observed quietly, watching Emily interact with her family, noting patterns and behaviors that she had overlooked before. She also discovered that Emily was still seeing Michael. That revelation came during a brief conversation between the siblings when Michael casually mentioned that he had cut things off with Emily, describing her as getting too attached. Catherine didn't respond at the time. She simply logged it, another piece of a twisted puzzle. Eventually, Catherine made the decision to go to law enforcement. She presented the screenshots and described everything she had witnessed. The messages were reviewed, but because they stopped short of outlining a concrete plan, investigators couldn't pursue charges. There was no direct threat, no declared intent, and nothing linking Emily to a physical act of harm. Still, Catherine believed her mother was in danger. She began to pull back from Emily, canceling hangouts, ignoring texts. Emily noticed. She grew more persistent, more intrusive, often showing up unannounced or insisting they talk. But Catherine had already made up her mind. Distance was necessary. Within a week, Catherine had planned to tell her mother everything. But she never got the chance. It was a routine Saturday afternoon. Carly Soule had left the house around midday to pick up a few things from a shopping complex just outside their neighborhood. She told Catherine she'd be back within an hour and that they'd go over the church bulletin for Sunday together later that evening. She never made it home. Surveillance footage from the parking lot of the retail plaza showed Carly walking out of a store around 1:42 p.m., carrying a single bag. Moments later, a masked figure approached her near the driver's side of her vehicle. The altercation lasted less than 30 seconds. Witnesses reported hearing a single shout before shots rang out. The suspect fled on foot, leaving Carly collapsed beside her car. By the time paramedics arrived, she was already gone. Initial reports described the scene as a possible robbery gone wrong. Her purse was missing, and her wallet had been discarded a few feet away. But the crime scene didn't align with a typical theft. There were no signs of struggle, no attempt to steal her vehicle, and no trace of the shooter's identity beyond partial footprints and limited camera angles. Nothing about the act felt spontaneous. Investigators noted that it had the markings of a targeted killing masked as something else. Word of Carly's death spread quickly through the community. Within hours, the family home was surrounded by grieving church members and concerned neighbors. Pastor Soule was reportedly in visible shock, clinging to his children while avoiding eye contact with nearly everyone. Catherine, according to those present, was eerily silent. Michael broke down during a prayer circle in the backyard. Detectives conducted preliminary interviews with the family that same evening. Catherine shared the screenshots she had previously shown to authorities, once again insisting that Emily Taylor had made vague but disturbing references to Carly as an obstacle. She also revealed her growing suspicion that Emily may have been involved more directly. Emily was brought in for questioning the next day. She denied all involvement, stating that she had been at home during the time of the shooting, watching a movie and texting with friends. She provided a time-stamped alibi with messages from a college acquaintance. However, when detectives traced her phone's location, it showed a brief signal loss in the area near the shopping center around the same window of time. Despite the inconsistency, investigators couldn't place her directly at the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, and no weapon tied her to the shooting. The phone evidence was deemed circumstantial, and the messages Catherine had provided still lacked explicit proof of a murder plot. Emily walked free. Carly's funeral was held 4 days later. Over 300 people attended. The pastor led the service, his voice cracking only once during the eulogy. He spoke of forgiveness, of grace, of endurance. Catherine sat beside her brother in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. By the end of that week, everything had changed. But no one could yet see the full collapse that was still coming. Carly's murder left a gaping wound in the Soule family, but for Catherine, the aftermath became something deeper. Obsession mixed with paralysis. Her suspicions hadn't just been confirmed, they'd been ignored. The girl she once called her best friend had been released without consequence, and her father, the man who should have been grieving, became increasingly unreachable. According to accounts later gathered during the investigation, Pastor Soule became withdrawn but not broken in the way others expected. He didn't shut down, nor did he lash out. Instead, he spent long hours away from home, often claiming church business or visits with bereaved members of the congregation. Catherine, now consumed with grief and suspicion, began watching him. She noticed missed calls from Emily still appearing on the household phone log. Days later, her brother Michael mentioned that Emily had texted him again, apologizing for everything and saying she still missed the family. He had ignored it. Catherine hadn't. She started driving around in the evenings, sometimes trailing her father when he left for what he called late-night prayer visits. She didn't tell Michael. She didn't need to. On a Thursday evening, nearly 6 weeks after the funeral, Catherine followed her father out of the neighborhood. His car took a turn off the highway and headed down a side road near the outskirts of town. It was a stretch of poorly lit industrial lots and empty gravel pull-offs. She slowed her own car and parked at a distance. His vehicle was there, motionless, half shielded by overgrown bushes. From her angle, she couldn't see much through the windows. But then, the movement confirmed what she feared. The car rocked slightly. She got out, walking slowly, each footstep deliberate. As she approached, the muffled sounds became clearer, rhythmic, unmistakable. She reached the passenger side window. Inside, her father, half undressed, and Emily were entangled again. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary encounter for them, but for Catherine, it was the collapse of whatever pieces of her family still remained intact. She didn't scream. She didn't pound on the window. She turned around, walked back to her car, and sat in silence. What happened in the next few minutes remains partially unclear, even in later statements. What is known is that Catherine had kept a small pistol in her glove compartment, registered, unused. She returned to the parked car. Her father didn't see her coming. 10 shots were fired through the window. Investigators confirmed that every round hit the passenger side. Emily Taylor was pronounced dead at the scene. William's soul, startled and scrambling, reportedly stepped out of the car in shock, trousers still around his knees. Catherine stood just feet away, breathless, the gun still warm in her hands. A passerby on the road, startled by the gunfire, called 911. Police arrived minutes later to find Emily slumped in the passenger seat and Catherine seated calmly on the ground. Williams, disoriented and partially clothed, was detained on site. Both were taken into custody without resistance. The town's faith in the Soule family and everything they had once stood for fractured instantly. The investigation that followed the shooting unraveled the quiet horror that had been simmering beneath the Soule family's surface for years. The initial crime scene was processed overnight. Emily Taylor's body was removed before sunrise. Catherine and her father were transported separately to the county holding facility, where they were booked, photographed, and held for questioning. Catherine didn't deny pulling the trigger. In her signed statement, she outlined the timeline of events leading to that night, her discovery of the relationship between Emily and her father, the ignored warning signs, the death of her mother, and her unrelenting belief that Emily had manipulated her way into their family with malicious intent. But what shocked investigators wasn't just her composure. It was the trail of evidence she presented, backed by text messages, photos, and call logs she had carefully archived for months. She detailed what she had shown the police weeks prior to Carly's death, how she had tried to stop what she believed was coming, and how nothing was done. The timeline painted a grim portrait of negligence and predatory behavior. William Soule, on the other hand, claimed he had no knowledge of any threat against his wife, and denied any involvement in Emily's planning or motivations. His answers were calculated and cold. When asked about the affair, he acknowledged a lapse in judgment, referring to Emily as a spiritual project that went too far. But when pressed on the possibility that Emily had a role in Carly's death, he offered little. "I don't know what she was capable of," he reportedly said. "I wasn't in her head." That statement did not sit well with detectives. Church leadership issued a brief statement asking for prayers and privacy, but the congregation splintered almost immediately. Some members stood by Catherine, calling her brave, even righteous. Others were horrified by the violence and confused by the layers of betrayal. Michael Soule remained out of the spotlight during the early days of the fallout. Detectives had spoken with him briefly after the shooting. He confirmed he had been sexually involved with Emily in the past, but ended things weeks before Carly's murder. He provided alibis, opened his phone to investigators, and was later ruled out as having any knowledge of the crime. The district attorney announced that both Catherine and Pastor Soule would face charges, Catherine for second-degree murder, and Williams for charges relating to unlawful sexual conduct and obstruction in the ongoing investigation tied to Carly's death. While Emily's murder was indisputable, questions remained about whether she had been involved in Carly's killing. and whether Williams had known more than he let on. Catherine was transferred to a detention center without incident. Her court-appointed attorney released a brief statement, saying, "This is a tragedy rooted in negligence, loss, and systemic failure to protect a grieving daughter." And so, the image of the perfect Sowell family officially crumbled. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Catherine Sowell's arraignment. Members of the community who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in Sunday services now sat divided in pews of judgment. Some wept, others stared in silence. But all came to witness what was left of a family that had, until recently, seemed untouchable. Catherine stood in court, flanked by her attorney. Her plea was not guilty. Her defense strategy centered around the emotional weight of accumulated trauma. Losing her mother under suspicious circumstances, discovering a betrayal that pierced her home from every direction, and eventually witnessing her father engaged in the very act that confirmed her darkest suspicions. Her legal team filed motions to submit her text records, screenshots, and previous reports to law enforcement as evidence of provocation and mental distress. Pastor William Sowell, once a commanding figure behind a pulpit, appeared far smaller when brought in for arraignment. The state charged him with felony counts related to unlawful sexual misconduct with a person under his spiritual authority, as well as obstruction of justice tied to the investigation into his wife's murder. Though there was no evidence linking him directly to Carly's death, his continued silence around Emily's potential involvement cast a shadow over his public image. The judge denied bail for Catherine, citing the violent nature of the crime and the risk of public unrest. Her legal team began preparing for a lengthy trial. Meanwhile, her brother Michael reportedly refused to visit either of them. He stayed in their childhood home for a short time before moving out of state to live with extended family. Catherine's trial began early the following year. Psychologists testified on the effects of unresolved trauma and emotional destabilization. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation. But in closing arguments, her attorney reminded the jury of one thing. This was not a story of calculated murder. It was a culmination, a thread of inaction, abandonment, and silence. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Catherine was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7. William Sowell accepted a plea deal on lesser charges. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and was permanently barred from any religious leadership or spiritual counseling positions. Emily Taylor's burial was a quiet one, attended by a few distant relatives. No memorials, no obituaries, just a headstone with her name and 2 dates. Carly's memory, however, lingered in every corner of the town. A women's shelter was later named in her honor, organized by friends who believed she had been trying to survive something long before anyone else noticed. And the Sowell family? A picture once framed in perfection, now hung shattered in the collective memory of a community that learned sometimes evil doesn't come from outside the home. Sometimes it wears a collar and smiles from the pulpit. Before you leave, remember this. Behind every headline is a shattered family, a life lost, and a truth too heavy to ignore. If stories like this move you, share them. Talk about them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime's Corner. Because silence only helps the darkness. Let's keep exposing the truth.